florist, the photographer, the adoption agencies, all the things that we finished the previous talk. So, a couple years ago, after Obamacare was passed, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, on her own authority, so nothing that Congress did, something that the agency did, a bureaucratic government agency, said that there were going to be 20 drugs and devices that every healthcare plan in the United States would have to cover cost-free. And so that meant whoever was providing the plan would have to pay for the coverage. They created a 3-tier system. Houses of worship were totally exempt from this regulation. Religious nonprofits were given an accommodation in which they could fill out a form which then authorized someone else on their behalf to cover the 20 drugs and devices. So it's kind of like, well, you're not pulling the trigger yourself, but you're hiring a hitman to do it for you, is one of the analogies that they've used for why it creates a problem. And then everyone else. So Hobby Lobby was in the everyone else category. They were neither exempt nor accommodated. Hobby Lobby, if you're familiar with the case, it's owned by evangelical Christians. Their starting salary for their entry-level employee is twice the federally mandated minimum wage, and they provide much better health care than what Obamacare mandates. But there were 4 drugs and devices that they couldn't cover, because those 4 drugs and devices that the HHS was now mandating they cover all carried FDA labels that said they could cause abortion. And so the owners of Hobby Lobby, the Green family, simply said, we're not providing health insurance for drugs and devices that can kill. That violates our beliefs as evangelicals. We provide better health care, health insurance for our employees than what they would get with Obamacare on the exchanges. And we pay them twice what the federal government mandates we pay employees. So why are you harassing us? Leave us free to run our business in accordance with our beliefs. We believe that our employees want to work for us because we provide them with a great work environment. They're closed on Sundays, which means all of their employees get to have a day off. And they close early in the evening. I think they close like at 8 o'clock at night, whereas their competitors are open to 9 or 10, precisely so their employees can get home, be with their families. They have it explicitly in their bylaws that every member of the board of Hobby Lobby has to be an active, professed Christian, and it says that the business exists to glorify God and has to be operated according to Christian principles of business, which is why they do the things that they do for their employees. Nevertheless, the Obama administration argued that Hobby Lobby couldn't exercise religion because it was a for-profit corporation. That on a certain understanding of religion, religion is only what takes place inside the 4 walls of a chapel. And so once you step out into the marketplace, you have to leave your religious convictions behind. And that if you think religion is just the freedom to worship, which is something that we've heard articulated by members of the Obama administration in the past several years, then you couldn't be exercising religion in the workplace. But if you think religion is both the search for the truth, the adherence to the truth, the relationship, and action in accordance with the truth, then it's going to make a difference to how you do everything in life. Right? So Christians understand that it's not just about Sunday morning worship. It's what we do Monday through Friday as well. It's what we do in our homes. It's what we do in our businesses. And most people want conscientious business owners. I mean, there's this whole thing about corporate responsibility, divesting from various countries that liberals don't like, and having non-factory farmed animals at Chipotle. So they want all sorts of moral and ethical business procedures when it lines up with lefty values. But then they seem not to be open to allowing people to bring their moral convictions, their religious beliefs, if it's on a conservative issue. So there's a double standard at stake here. Anyway, Hobby Lobby won this case. I mean, that's the good thing. But the fact of the matter is they had to sue and go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court with the Obama administration actively arguing against them, and they only won in a 5-4 decision. So to give you an idea of just how precarious their victory is, it was Anthony Kennedy who was the swing vote. And anytime Anthony Kennedy is, what stands between you and and your freedom, you have to be concerned. And it wasn't litigated under the First Amendment, it was litigated under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a sign that, I know this will come up more in the next session, but I'll mention it now. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed in 1993, unanimously in the House. It passed with 97 votes in the Senate. Ted Kennedy was its lead sponsor. Chuck Schumer, who was then a representative in the House, was its lead sponsor in the House. And Bill Clinton signed it into law. Because they thought at the time they were going to be protecting peyote smoking Native Americans and things like that. They didn't realize at the time that 20 years later it would be incredibly useful for protecting the religious freedom of the Greens and the Hans. The Hans are Mennonite Christians who own a woodworking company that was also protected that same day at the Supreme Court. It only became controversial within the past 2 or 3 years when states were passing state versions of RFRAs, Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, because they realized, oh wait, it won't just protect the peyote smoking Native Americans, it might also protect the Christians whom we don't like. And it might protect Hobby Lobby, and it might protect the baker, and it might protect the adoption agency, and we don't want to protect them. That's when religious liberty became a partisan issue. Conservatives, Republicans didn't make it a partisan issue. Liberals and people on the left who stopped supporting religious liberty. Chuck Schumer was tweeting about the Indiana Religious Freedom Bill, saying how outrageous it was when it's the same exact law that he sponsored 20 years earlier in the federal government. And the version that he sponsored was originally meant to protect against both federal government and state and local government action. The Supreme Court struck down that latter portion. The Supreme Court said the federal government can only tie its own hands. So the federal government can pass a religious freedom law that says we, the federal government, can't violate religious freedom in this way, but they can't tell the states what to do. So that's why you want to have laws like this at the state level as well. But it's interesting, who's the one demagoguing religious liberty? Last term at the Supreme Court, there was a case involving a Muslim inmate, whether or not he would be allowed to grow a half-inch beard for religious reasons. Conservatives supported him in that. The Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, the major religious liberty nonprofit law company, the ones who represented Hobby Lobby at the Supreme Court, also represented the Muslim. Their founder, Seamus Hassan, wrote a book called The Right to Be Wrong, and the catchphrase was, we protect religious liberty from A through Z, Anglican to Zoroastrian. And their history of 20 years being a public interest law firm is doing just that. They don't just protect religious believers who they happen to like or happen to agree with, they protect all religious believers. And here's the balancing test. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act says government can only substantially burden the free exercise of religion when it's doing so for a compelling state interest in the least restrictive way possible. And so the question here with Hobby Lobby was, well, if you exempted houses of worship, and if you created an accommodation for religious nonprofits, haven't you yourselves already admitted there's a less restrictive way of accomplishing whatever your goal is here? Why can't you give to Hobby Lobby what you gave to the Little Sisters of the Poor? And the state had no response to that. So the way that the Hobby Lobby decision was decided was simply to say, according to the federal government itself, there is a less restrictive way of doing this, and it's called the accommodation. Now the question is whether or not the accommodation itself is the least restrictive way of doing this. So the Little Sisters of the Poor, Wheaton College, the University of Notre Dame, several Baptist universities, the Catholic Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. There are about 200 plaintiffs. 7 of the cases have been accepted for review by the Supreme Court, but all 200 of these plaintiffs will be bound up in this case. Their point is that this isn't the least restrictive way of accomplishing your task. You don't have to co-opt us and our healthcare plans at all. If your goal is to provide cost-free contraceptives to all women, do it yourself. Don't use our healthcare plan and have us be the ones that are setting up the infrastructure and then contracting with the insurance company and then signing the letter that authorizes them to provide drugs and devices that violate our beliefs. That's going to be decided, the oral arguments will probably be in mid-March, and then in mid to late June is when the Supreme Court will announce its decision. If James Madison or George Washington were here today, the first thing they would say before why are as a group of Roman Catholic nuns forced to sue the President of the United States, why aren't they religious enough to get the exemption, would be, what authorized the Department of Health and Human Services to issue this mandate in the first place? Right? Their first question would be, we didn't establish the federal government to be doing Obamacare. That's not a federal power. And then certainly it's not the authority of an agency to then implement Obamacare in this sort of a way. So that would be one, is it's an overgrowth of the state. Second, it would be, consistently we've heard people on the left say, religious liberty is just the right to worship. They're going to say, no, what we protected was the free exercise of religion. That includes freedom to worship, right? So you should be free when you're inside your chapel, but you should also be free outside of the chapel to lead your life in accordance with these beliefs. I think those are the sorts of responses that the founding fathers, before they then started getting into the litigation, into the weeds, those would be the sorts of questions they had. Let me turn to the marriage cases. And I think this is then going to highlight another kind of prime example of where some of the tension is. So in the marriage cases, what we saw, the first consequence of Massachusetts redefining marriage was that Catholic Charities of Boston was forced to shut down its adoption agency. Catholic Charities of Boston had one of the most successful adoption agencies in all of America. The church was taking care of widows and orphans long before the nation state and the political states even existed. And they had a huge track record at placing the hardest to place kids. What was interesting here is that lots of people are interested in adopting newborn babies. Fewer families are interested in adopting 5 or 10-year-olds that have behavioral problems. So depending on whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, you can either credit this to Christian charity or Catholic guilt. But one way or the other, Catholic charity adoption agencies were able to get families to be more generous than they otherwise were inclined to be, and to be willing to adopt the children that other families were consistently passing over. And so kids who would have kept bouncing around in the foster care system were finding homes in loving, married, mother-father families. And then the state said, well, wait, we now have marriage equality. Unless you treat all married couples equally, you're violating our Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Non-Discrimination Act. And we won't give you the license to run an adoption agency if you're going to discriminate. Catholic Charity Adoption Agency wasn't trying to prevent gays and lesbians from adopting from other agencies. So gays and lesbians were free to adopt from the state adoption agency. They were free to adopt from the secular humanist adoption agency. All they asked for was the freedom to continue taking care of orphans and to continue finding homes for those children consistent with their beliefs. And the state said no. And this does absolutely nothing to help more children find more homes. All it does is it scores a point for political correctness, and it uses children as kind of hostages in this adult culture war. Next example, Gordon College. It's an evangelical school also outside of Boston. And about 2 years ago, the president of Gordon College signed a letter that went to President Obama saying that if you issue one of these sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination executive orders, can you include a religious liberty exemption so that a religious school like Gordon wouldn't be caught in the crosshairs? The letter was leaked. It was revealed that Michael Lindsay had signed the letter, the president of Gordon. Gordon is actually, they're an Orthodox school, but they're more politically progressive. They're more politically on the left than most conservative evangelical colleges. But once it was found out that they had a campus policy that required all members of the Gordon community to live by the Christian virtue of chastity, which meant that sexual relations were reserved for marriage, marriage was understood as the Bible understands it, a union of a man and a woman, their accrediting agency said, we're going to have to investigate whether or not Gordon deserves to remain an accredited four-year college. The public school district in which Gordon was located said, Gordon college students can no longer be student teachers in our school district. So the Lynn County School District kicked out the Gordon College students from its student teacher program. Again, this does nothing to help the students in the Lynn County school systems. It's a rather bad public school system, and these Gordon student teachers, many of them were just volunteering, they're doing it to fulfill their student teaching hours. They were actually providing these public school students with better teachers, but they had been kicked out again because of this rule. Gordon did a year-long internal audit, and at the end they prevailed. They didn't change any of their policies. I think the accrediting agency realized that this was not a fight they could win yet. During oral arguments this past April, Justice Alito asked the Solicitor General of the United States about Bob Jones University. And I mentioned that earlier. The Bob Jones University case was a evangelical school that prohibited interracial dating on campus. The IRS stripped them of their nonprofit tax status. They sued, claiming religious liberty. They got up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denied them their challenge. They said, look, the IRS gets to decide who qualifies as a nonprofit. They're saying that your policy prohibiting interracial dating goes against federal policy of racial equality. And so they have determined that you're not eligible for the tax-exempt status, and that doesn't violate your constitutional rights. IRS is free to do that. So Alito asked the Solicitor General, what's going to happen to religious schools that continue to teach and to have conduct standards about marriage in the union of a man and a woman? Are they going to lose their nonprofit tax status? And the Solicitor General's response was, I don't deny it, Justice Alito. It's going to be an issue. I don't deny it. It's going to be an issue. I was in the courtroom that day, and it was a chilling moment during oral arguments because normally the lawyer would just lie to the judges to tell them what they want to hear. Right? I mean, so you would say, oh, of course we would never do that. Justice Alito, we know that Orthodox Jews and Roman Catholics and evangelical Christians and Latter-day Saints and all sorts of religious communities in their Orthodox formulations believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. That's radically different than racism. We would never treat them as if they were operating on racist beliefs. And that's not what he said. He could have said that, but it's not what he said. And the supposition among many is that someone within the Obama administration had told him not to say that. They want to retain the option of at some point, if not in this administration, maybe in the Hillary Clinton administration, of revoking the nonprofit tax status. Most of you know, especially this is true on the East Coast, that Christian schools are barely scraping by. You see newspaper headlines about school closures, consolidations, especially in the big cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, DC. They can't make ends meet as it is. If they lost their nonprofit tax status, so all the gifts that people would be donating weren't tax exempt, so they have to pay taxes on those gifts. If they had to pay taxes on what they receive as income, they had to pay property taxes. Right? So if you have St. Patrick's Cathedral in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, can you imagine what those property taxes would be if you weren't registered as a nonprofit organization? It would simply put even more of these schools out of business. What's remarkable about these schools, again, especially in the big cities on the East Coast, is that they're frequently educating non-Catholics, some of the poorest of the poor trying to escape the bad public school system, and providing them with outcomes vastly superior to what the public schools are doing. So I forget who it was. It was an atheist Jewish businessman who had donated several $1 million to the Catholic school system in New York. He says, you guys work miracles for these kids. Here you have poor black kids who aren't Catholic attending Catholic schools, and you're able to educate them in a way that no one else is. And I simply care about that. I don't care about God. I'm giving you money to educate these kids. That'll be what's at stake here. And again, what we're seeing is who's being held hostage, children being held hostage because of a political correct adult culture war. the last example I want to give are the baker, the florist, and the photographer. Because what's most interesting about these cases is that not a single one of them involved a situation in which the professional said, oh, I refuse to serve gay people. You know, it wasn't a bakery that said, oh, we don't sell cakes if you're gay, or a florist shop that said, we don't do flowers for you if you're gay. They had no problem doing that. They bake happy birthday cakes for gay customers. They do get well soon flower arrangements for lesbian customers. Their only objection was to the same-sex wedding. They didn't want to use their God-given gifts and talents to help celebrate what they believed was telling a lie about God's intentions for marriage. They said that violates our beliefs, that violates our conscience. One of the best-known cases involves Baronelle Stutzman. She's a 71-year-old evangelical grandmother. She's had gay employees work for her in her floral studio. She was selling flowers to this particular gay couple for a decade. And it was only after Washington State redefined marriage that they decided they were going to get married, and they asked her to do the flowers for their wedding, and she had to say, I can't. She sat down with one of them, his name's Roger. She explained to Roger, look, I've been selling you flowers for a decade. You know how much I love you, but I can't do wedding flowers for a same-sex wedding. She was then sued by the Attorney General, saying that we won't tolerate that sort of discrimination in our state. In the neighboring state of Oregon, you have Aaron and Melissa Klein, young evangelicals. They have 5 small children, I think all under the age of 10 or 12, somewhere there. 5 small kids. They were supporting their family of 5 with a bakery that they had called Sweet Cakes by Melissa. It was a consignment bakery. They were asked to do a same-sex wedding, to make the wedding cake for it. Aaron had to tell the couple that we can't do that, we don't do same-sex wedding cakes. They were sued, and the judgment goes through an administrative bureau, the Bureau of Labor and Industries, BOLI is the acronym. And the administrative adjudicator fined them $135,000 for the pain and suffering that they had caused to the same-sex couple. They were forced to shut down their bakery. Aaron now works as a trashman. He's a garbage collector, and that's how he makes half what they used to make when they were running their bakery, and that's how he supports the family. The simplest thing to say is that, unfortunately, there are some voices and forces within the LGBT community that are not seeking to live and let live. It's very much we're going to impose our values on you. Because what's interesting is that it's not as if evangelical Christians in Washington State and Oregon have a monopoly on cake baking and flower arranging. Right? It's not as if you couldn't go to a different florist or a different baker or a different photographer. In fact, all of these people who sued were able to find service within a very short drive where they initially were unable to. There are plenty of photographers and bakers and florists who support same-sex marriage and are interested in making money. So the win-win kind of live and let live solution would say, if you're in favor of gay marriage, bake the gay wedding cake. If you're not in favor of gay marriage, don't bake the gay wedding cake, but you'll lose business. Your competitor will make that money, and there might be an economic cost, right? So markets can sort these things out. In the framework that I mentioned under RFRA, what's the compelling state interest that's being pursued in the least restrictive way of forcing every baker and every florist and every photographer to take the wedding photos and make the wedding cakes and do the wedding flowers at every wedding? What is that government purpose that's being served in the least restrictive way? If it's not simply one of conformity or of enforcing a speech code or in signaling that this viewpoint doesn't deserve to be permitted in the public square. It seems rather clear that what's going on here is an intentional program of eliminating the ability of people of faith to operate in the public square in accordance with their beliefs about marriage. So the question becomes what to do about this. After Roe v. Wade, there were some activists on the left who said abortion is a constitutional right, abortion is health care like any other piece of health care. Therefore, every doctor and every nurse and every pharmacist in every hospital should be forced to perform and pay for abortion. Those activists lost. Through a variety of laws and pieces of public policy at both the federal and the state level, we established the principle that pro-life doctors and nurses and hospitals and pharmacists do not need to be coerced by the government into performing or paying for abortion. This is what makes it possible for Catholic hospitals to still exist. This is what makes it possible for evangelicals to be doctors and nurses and pharmacists. One of the first laws was called the Church Amendment. It's named not for stone buildings with steeples and bell towers, but named for the Democratic senator from Idaho, Frank Church. And so Senator Church said, we should be able to agree to disagree. The Supreme Court has said a woman has a constitutional right to choose abortion, but her freedom to choose an abortion doesn't mean anyone else has a duty to perform abortion or to pay for her abortion. Her freedom to have an abortion doesn't negate my freedom not to perform an abortion, or my freedom not to pay for an abortion. So it was the Church Amendment. There's then something known as the Weldon Amendment, a variety of protections at the federal and local level to protect the conscience rights of medical professionals. And up until the HHS mandate, this had been respected. I mean, what made the HHS mandate so outrageous was after 40 years of a consensus that you don't make pro-lifers pay for or perform abortion, we were now making them pay for abortion. And about a month ago, the ACLU sued Trinity Healthcare Systems, it's the largest Catholic network of hospitals, to force them to perform abortion. So it's interesting, what's taking place now is that arguments that had been long settled, settled in the 70s, and then we lived that outcome in the 80s and the 90s, and the first part of this new century, are now being reopened and relitigated. Now, I mentioned that it's only some voices and some forces within the LGBT movement that are in favor of the adoption agencies being shuttered, schools losing their nonprofit tax status, and the Baker Florence and photographer. The reason I say that is many Americans who are in favor of gay marriage respond in horror when they hear about the $135,000 fine that the clients have to pay. Many people who support gay marriage thought they were supporting a live and let live situation. Many gay activists themselves aren't interested. They know what it feels like to be bullied and oppressed. They aren't now interested in being the bullies and the oppressors. So I think it's going to be vitally important to try to form a coalition of people who are even in favor of gay marriage, but not in favor of coercion on gay marriage. People who can say, look, I'm in favor of the right of a gay couple to get married, but I don't think that means that other people lose their rights to believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman and to act on that belief in the public square. I disagree with them, but I don't think the government should be coercing them. And I think a large part of the success of that will be the ability for each and every one of us to make the case for our beliefs. So the reason that this morning's lecture mainly focused on understanding the secular argument for marriage was that when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, my average classmate was a secular pro-choice individual. They disagreed with me about abortion, but they could understand why I believe what I believe about abortion. So they could say, I'm personally pro-choice, but I understand why Ryan believes the unborn child is a human being with human rights, and therefore I don't want the government violating his conscience. I don't want the government coercing him with respect to this. Someone's question when I mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church. My average classmate at Princeton, despite the best of my efforts for the past several years, still doesn't understand why I believe what I believe about marriage. And insofar as our average neighbor thinks the Westboro Baptist Church speaks for us, and speaks for that 71-year-old grandmother, and speaks for the adoption agency, they're going to be much less inclined to respect our religious freedom or to protect our rights of conscience. So I don't think, some people said, oh, stop talking about marriage, just talk about religious liberty. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to talk about both. Because I think what we know as a cultural reality is that your freedom is protected when the underlying issue that you seek to exercise your freedom on makes sense to people, even if they disagree with it. So most people say right now, look, I disagree with the nuns, but do we really want the Obama administration telling Roman Catholic nuns that they have to pay for contraception? Like, yeah, we disagree with the Catholic Church on this, but we know this is what Catholics believe, right? It's why I'm not a Catholic. I think they're crazy. But do we need the government say that they can't be Catholic? These are women who signed up to be nuns. I think the more successful we are, especially it was clearer in the Hobby Lobby case, since it wasn't about contraception, it was just the 4 drugs and devices that could cause abortion. People were saying, wait a minute, I don't want the government telling people that they have to purchase drugs and devices that could cause abortion. I'm personally pro-choice, but I realize this issue is so important and so sensitive that I don't want people's consciences violated on either side. The challenge for us on the marriage issue would be, can we explain what we believe about human sexuality and the nature of marriage in a way that even people who end up still disagreeing with us can understand it and will be willing to defend our freedoms publicly. That's going to be the challenge. So I'm going to stop there, and then we'll have more time in this session for your questions. Thank you. Yep.
I think it's rather dangerous to talk about the bakers, the florists, the photographers, saying that there are alternatives where the homosexuals can go for their marriage services, because that's irrelevant. If there were no alternatives, we still have our rights to refuse. Religious liberty is that important that alternatives are irrelevant.
Well, yes and no. I mean, so it's a legal matter. I mean, the legal doctrine here.
They can bake their own cakes. They can take their own photographs. They can grow their own flowers. Religious liberty trumps those things.
In an ideal, reasonable universe, what you just said would be true. In our actual universe,
You mean in our fascist control freak police state?
Let him answer the question.
in however you want to describe our actual universe, it helps people to know that in all of these jurisdictions, there were other photographers and florists and bakers more than willing and able and ready to provide those services. Because again, think about it, if you're someone who disagrees with yourself, right? So if you're the liberal who says, well, actually, I do think it's important that the gay couple is able to get wedding flowers and a wedding cake and have their wedding photos taken. And I think it's unreasonable to tell them to grow their own flowers and to bake their own cake and to somehow take their own pictures. The wedding selfie is probably less than a desirable way of doing the wedding pictures. If you're that liberal person, knowing that, wait, there were other professionals willing to do this, this is unlike other situations. So to take an example from history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Why is it that the federal government passed a federal law that included protections against racism? Right? So this was an anti-discrimination statute including the basis protection of race. Well, because in the South, there were many jurisdictions in which you couldn't receive some of these essential services if you were African American. Right? After generations of race-based